As you know, the three partners have a virtual meeting scheduled for tomorrow. The expectation is a constructive exchange, and honestly, I would not expect any major drama tomorrow. 90%. That is the share of everything Canada sells into the United States that has been protected from Donald Trump's tariffs by one single agreement. And today, July 1st, that agreement reached the exact point where its future begins to be decided. But here is the part most people are not putting first. The Trump administration is expected to move straight past that deadline without signing the renewal. And if you live in Canada, this is not some distant political story happening in another country. This is the system behind the price of your car, your groceries, and the job market your children are about to enter. Let me set the scene because the timing is almost too perfect. Exactly 6 years ago today, on July 1st, 2020, CUSMA came into effect, replacing the old NAFTA framework. Inside that agreement, Article 34.7 included a clause requiring the three countries to sit down on the 6th anniversary and each declare in writing whether they wanted to extend the deal for another 16 years, all the way to 2042. Canada said yes. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc sent the letter. Mexico's Economy Secretary Marcelo Ebrard sent his as well. Two of the three partners arrived ready to commit. The third partner, Washington, quietly made clear it was not planning to give up that leverage before the real negotiations even began. Now, this next part is important because I had to read it twice myself. The headlines make it sound like something much more dramatic than it actually is. Missing this deadline does not end CUSMA. It does not expire today, and it does not expire this year. Under the agreement's own wording, if all three countries do not agree to the full extension, the deal simply moves into yearly reviews for the remaining 10 years. It stays fully active until 2036, unless one of the countries formally withdraws, and that requires 6 months' notice. So the day of reckoning framing you may have seen is not what the document actually says. But here is what people often miss about why this still matters so much. For decades, Canada built most of its export economy around one customer. Roughly 3/4 of everything we sell abroad goes to the United States. That is not just a partnership. Structurally, that is dependency. When one country buys 3 out of every 4 export dollars you earn, every tariff threat, every Oval Office mood swing, every comment about not needing Canada lands directly on your economy. CUSMA matters because it is the one contract that stops that dependency from becoming a chokehold. It is why compliant goods can still cross the border at an effective tariff rate near 10%, while much of the rest of the world faces higher duties. Remove that shield, and the vulnerability Canada spent decades building does not just become visible, it begins to define the country. And this is the number I keep coming back to. When Trump's team imposed a 72-hour, 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican goods back in 2025, it was not Canadian exporters who rushed to the White House in panic. It was American manufacturers warning Washington directly that they could not keep building products if their parts suddenly cost 25% more. They were the ones saying they might have to send their own workers home. Think about that for a moment. The loudest warnings about the cost of hitting Canada came from Americans. So the real question hanging over this July 1st moment is not simply whether Canada is in trouble. The more interesting question is, who actually has the stronger hand once the real negotiation begins? I have been going through the trade data for weeks, and the story beneath the headlines is not the story being told on the surface. But before I show you those numbers, and they genuinely surprised me, you need to understand what Carney's government has been quietly doing while everyone else was watching Trump's press conferences. That is the setup. Now watch what actually happens next, because while Washington was loudly insisting it did not need Canada, the numbers were quietly telling a very different story. Here is what surprised me when I looked through the Statistics Canada figures for 2025. Yes, Canadian exports to the United States did fall. They dropped by roughly $29 billion over the year, and I am not going to pretend that did not hurt. But during that same period, Canadian exports to the rest of the world increased by about $27.5 billion. Think about that for a moment. Almost the entire decline in American demand was picked up by other markets. Non-US exports rose nearly 16% across the country. That is not what an economy being crushed looks like. That is what an economy rerouting itself looks like. And this is where Mark Carney's background becomes important. He is not making this up as he goes. When you have led two central banks, the Bank of Canada through the financial crisis and the Bank of England through Brexit, you do not panic every time a tariff headline crosses the screen. You understand that leverage in a negotiation is not about who makes the loudest threat. It is about who has alternatives. And the entire strategy Ottawa has been building is about creating those alternatives. The Trade Diversification Corridors Fund, new efforts to expand into the United Kingdom, the European Union, and Asia, and the federal goal of doubling Canada's non-US exports over the next decade are not random reactions to Trump. They look like pieces of a plan that had clearly been prepared well in advance. Now, to be fair, because I am not here to sell you a fantasy, a large part of Canada's non-US export growth in 2025 did not come from manufactured goods or a sudden boom in a new industry. Much of it came from gold and other safe haven metals, as investors moved money during a period of uncertainty. If you remove those precious metals from the calculation, the diversification story is still real, but smaller, closer to about $14 billion. And the number of Canadian companies actually selling into new foreign markets grew by only around 6%. So the honest conclusion is this: the pivot has begun, and it is working at the top end, but it is not yet broad enough or deep enough to call it complete. Anyone claiming Canada has already replaced the American market is trying to sell you something. But here is the causal chain that matters, and I think both sides underestimated it. Trump's tariffs were meant to create pain in Canada and force concessions, but they also created an unintended consequence. They gave Canadian businesses a hard financial reason to find a second customer. Pain became the accelerant. Before 2025, diversification was the kind of slogan governments repeated at ribbon cuttings. After a year of tariff whiplash, it became a survival instinct backed by federal money. So the tariffs that were supposed to increase American leverage over Canada may have quietly weakened it instead. Every dollar of trade that Canada moves off the American ledger is one less dollar Washington can threaten next time. That is the mechanism. When you squeeze a dependency, you teach it how to stop being dependent. Now look at the American side of the ledger, because this is the question I keep coming back to. If the purpose of all this pressure was to bring manufacturing home and support American workers, why are some of the loudest voices defending CUSMA coming from inside the U.S. agriculture lobby and American manufacturing? Their own farm groups have called the agreement the gold standard. Their own factories warned about the damage that would come from breaking it. When the people a policy is supposed to help are begging the government not to follow through, that usually means the slogan and the strategy do not match. That brings us to the part of the story that changes everything, because this is no longer only about Canada and the United States. It is about who has been watching. And that is where this stops being a normal trade dispute and starts becoming something much larger. Everything I just explained is the surface. Underneath it is the piece that reframes the entire situation. Canada is not dealing with this in isolation. Look at what China did during the same period. As the United States shifted its import patterns away from Chinese goods, China became one of the few major exporters that successfully reduced its dependence on the American market, and it did it faster than many analysts expected. Mexico, Canada's partner in this same agreement, has been running its own strategy as well. It has already completed 2 full rounds of formal talks with Washington, with a 3rd round scheduled, moving early and moving quickly. The lesson in front of Canada is one that other countries have already learned the hard way. You build your exits before the pressure reaches its peak, not after it has already pinned you down. Mexico understood that. China understood that. And for the first time in a long while, Canada is acting like it understands it too. There is also a historical pattern here that matters, because it explains why this moment feels different from earlier trade fights. In past disputes, whether over softwood lumber or older NAFTA battles, Canada mostly played defense. We absorbed the hit, went to court, waited it out, and came out the other side just as dependent on the United States as before. What has changed now is that the response is not only defensive. Canada has actually moved up to become the second largest source of American imports, passing China, even while Canadian shipments south have declined. That tells you the integration is still extremely deep on both sides. But at the same time, Ottawa is putting real federal money behind structural diversification, not just symbolic announcements. The playbook other countries used after the pressure had already arrived, Canada is now trying to use deliberately. That is the shift. Whether it fully succeeds or not, it changes the negotiating table, because a country with another place to sell has a much stronger ability to say no. Now, I want to give the other side honestly, because that matters. Trump's hardball approach has not been pure bluff, and pretending otherwise would not be serious. The tariffs caused real damage. Manufacturing-heavy communities such as Oshawa, London, Kitchener, Cambridge, and Waterloo took genuine hits, and the benefits of diversification have not reached those places yet. The Bank of Canada itself expects net exports to weigh on GDP growth into 2026. In the short term, Washington's pressure has created a real cost, and Mexico came to the table faster than Canada, partly because that kind of pressure can work. So if we are keeping score honestly, Trump's leverage is real. The question is whether it lasts. Does short-term pain turn into long-term concessions, or does it simply speed up the independence it was meant to stop? And here is the part that went almost completely unnoticed. The United States did not accidentally end up with this annual review mechanism. Washington was the side that pushed Article 34.7 into CUSMA in the first place. It was designed as a pressure valve, a way to keep leverage available indefinitely. So if the agreement moves into annual reviews instead of a clean long-term extension, that is not chaos. That is the machine operating exactly the way Washington designed it, which means the real fight was never truly about July 1st. It was always about the 10 years of negotiations this date quietly opens. So what does all of this actually mean for Canadians? For someone watching from Toronto, Calgary, or a small town somewhere in between, that is the question I said I would answer, and the answer is much closer to everyday life than it may seem, because everything we are talking about is about to show up at your kitchen table. Let's return to the number I opened with, 90%. Nearly 90% of Canadian exports entering the United States are still protected by this agreement. That is the shield. And now you can see why today was not the day that shield broke, but it was the day the 10-year fight over it officially began. Here is the part that has not been emphasized strongly enough. Let me bring all of this down from trade language into real life. Compliant goods still enter the United States at an effective tariff rate near 10%, which is far lower than what many other countries face. As long as that remains in place, the price pressure on cross-border goods stays somewhat controlled. But every annual review gives Washington another chance to push on Canada's most sensitive pressure points: dairy and poultry supply management, agricultural market access, and the rules that decide how much of a vehicle must be built in North America before it can cross the border duty-free. If those rules become tighter over the next decade, the cost will not stay locked inside a boardroom. It will move into the price of a new car, the cost of renovating a home, the appliances sitting in your kitchen, and the food processing chain that touches almost everything you buy at the grocery store. That is how a trade clause turns into part of your monthly budget. And with so many Canadian households already under pressure from housing and grocery costs, Even a small increase passed through at checkout is felt quickly. So where does this go over the next 6 to 12 months? There are two readings, and I will give you both. The American reading is this: stretch the talks beyond the midterms, keep the pressure of annual reviews in place, and wait for Canada to get tired enough to concede on dairy and autos. That is a real strategy, and in the short term, it has force behind it. The Canadian reading is different. Keep the shield intact. Continue quietly redirecting exports toward Europe and Asia, and negotiate from a position that becomes slightly less dependent every quarter. Carney's entire bet is that patience combined with diversification can beat panic. Canada does not need the fastest deal. It needs the right one. But there is an honest tension inside that strategy. Patience is easy to talk about from Ottawa, but much harder to live with in a factory town where orders have already slowed down. If the long game takes too long, domestic political pressure could force a quicker and weaker deal than the strategy would choose on paper. That is the real risk in Carney's approach, and it needs to be said clearly. Here is where I will state my view carefully. The data does not show that Canada has won. It shows that Canada has more options than it had 5 years ago. And in any negotiation, options are the entire game. Washington still carries enormous weight. 3/4 of Canadian exports cannot be rerouted overnight, and anyone telling you otherwise is not being honest. But the Canada that arrived at July 1st, 2026 is not the same Canada that entered Trump's first term. Back then, Canada negotiated because it had to. This time, more and more, it is negotiating because it can help shape the terms. That is not a victory lap. It is a stronger starting position than Canada has had in a generation. And it was earned the hard way, one redirected shipment and one new market at a time. The shield held today, the options are growing, and the next decade of this fight begins now, on terms that Canada has more power to influence than it has had in years. I have laid out the facts, I have shown both sides, and I have given you my read. Now I want yours. If you were sitting where Carney is right now, with the shield still intact, more options opening up, but the giant next door still holding most of your trade, would you hold the line and play the long game, or push for a fast deal to end the uncertainty? Because that is the question I keep coming back to. So tell me where you stand, and tell me if you think I have this right.